Hey guys, so I'm gonna record a little bit today, right now. As I mentioned yesterday in class, I forgot to record the beginning of the lecture from yesterday. So I'm going to kind of re-record a little bit of what I did. I'm not going to go over everything exactly again, but I'll just kind of go over the basic steps, and then I'll edit that together with the video from class. I also was like debugging and doing some kind of dumb stuff during class, so I'll edit those parts out to make the video a little bit less long. It's still going to be kind of long because there's different parts that we covered. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of re-record some of the steps at the beginning and then also record a little bit at the end to kind of finish up what we were close to finishing. So yeah, sorry about the kind of disjointed nature of this one, but hopefully this will be useful, and I'll put some timestamps on the YouTube video because it's probably going to be like an hour long or maybe more. So I'll put some timestamps on there so that you guys can find the parts that you might want to look at specifically. So just to get started, I'm not going to redo the drawings that I did for my art, but I did make this like little ice ball Pascal, and then the other Pascal that I made yesterday in class was the fireball. Let's see, where did I put these projectiles? So there's my fireball. And basically what I did for this is I just kind of made these simple drawings, and then I took the exact same art from the fireball and I did a paint all pixels to change the colors. You could also modify the colors in Godot if you wanted to, but I wanted to choose some specific colors. And these simple animations just have two parts. They have one part for flying through the air, and they have one part for when they hit something and they kind of break apart. So those are the two basic animations that you need for this to work. You might have other, components to the animation, but those are the main parts that you need for this. One thing that I was missing yesterday was a attack animation for my player to actually like throw these projectiles. So I'm going to do that real quick. And so I'll have that to add into my project. So I'm going to open up a new Pascal. I'm going to get my character animation pose and hit OK. And so I'm just going to update this a little bit. Let's close these other guys to make it look like my character is going to like throw this fireball. And so it depends a little bit on how you have this set up. If your character can throw like in the direction of the mouse, then you may need to have more sophisticated animations for this, where there's actually some directionality to it. But if you don't really care that much and it just goes straight, then it's a little bit easier. So I'm just going to do something simple for this. I'm going to first go to save as and go to call this character. He's just going to be throwing these fireballs, so I'll say character throw and save as, and I'll put this in my character animations. Click save. And I'm just going to delete the extra frames I have here, and I'll take my eraser and kind of erase these arms, and I'll erase the legs a little bit too. So it'll just be like a couple frames, maybe 2 or 3 frames, where my character is just going to kind of throw something that we can line up with the fireball. So I'll kind of point his feet in the direction that he's throwing a little bit, so that'll look a little bit more realistic. That foot is like a little too long. Let's kind of line them up a little bit. So we'll point his feet in that direction, and we'll get like a little wind up with this arm, and this arm will stick out for balance, something like that. And actually I should have duplicated my frames first, but that's okay. Let's do Shift N a couple times to add some new frames, and I'll just erase these again. And okay, so now we'll have the arm coming up a little bit. turn the onion skin on so we can see the previous. So back to the pen tool. And so it'll look like he's kind of raising his arm over here. And this arm will go down a little bit for some balance. That, and maybe we'll pick up one of the feet to kind of show some motion. It looks pretty bad, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. And then on the last frame, let's erase a little bit. And so this one, the arm has come all the way through. And my character is only one color, so it kind of makes it hard to have a lot of detail. But that's okay. That's sort of intentional, just to keep things simple. So we'll get this leg going all the way back like that. And then we'll have one arm. So this is the arm crossing his body and throwing the fireball. Made a little too much hand there. So the arm's not quite as long since it's crossing the body here. And let's put the other arm, not really a good place for the other arm. Like it could come down. I guess we could just kind of keep it over here. Just keeping the balance. Okay, so it's not perfect, but it's good enough for what I want to do. So I'm going to save this and export it. So I'll just go to export, go to download, and this is my character throw animation. So now I have another animation to use here. And so that'll make a little bit more sense when we put the animation in. One thing I forgot to do yesterday is connect the end of the animation to the throwing of the projectile. And I think part of why I did that was because I hadn't actually created this animation yet, and so I was kind of thrown off by that. All right, so I think I'm done in Pascal, at least for now. And so yesterday, I started recording right when I was about to start writing the code, I think. So I'm just gonna go over recreating the projectile scene. I'm gonna do it a little bit faster. So I'm gonna go back to my game and go to project.godot, open up my Godot engine. And so I'm gonna do this whole projectile thing again from scratch. So I'm just gonna follow these directions again from scratch and just kind of explain everything that I'm going over. So yesterday I created this scene for my fireball. So I'm just gonna delete that and start from scratch. So I'm gonna delete this and start over. Okay, so as I mentioned in class yesterday, our fireball is going to be in area 2D. So to create this new scene, I can just use the basic default Godot interface and click on other node and then type in area 2D. And as I mentioned in this class, yesterday in class, I kind of went over this a little bit. The area 2D is essentially just an area that detects whether or not something is inside of it. So if we have an area 2D, so an area 2D is basically just a box. It doesn't do anything physics-wise, like things can pass through it in either direction. Basically what it does is tell me if something is overlapping with it. So if I have like an enemy here, and the enemy is gonna have like a little hit area right here, and my projectile is gonna be headed towards the enemy, what the area 2D, it's just going to tell me if these things are overlapping. It's not going to create a collision or do anything else. So I went over this briefly in class yesterday. Let's just look at it again. So if I go into node 2D, go to my collision objects, you can see that the area 2D is a collision object, but all of my other collision objects are part of the physics body 2D section. And so depending on what type of node you're creating, you might want to use different ones of those. So just to quickly cover them, I just talked about the area 2D. A static body 2D doesn't move, so things will run into it and they'll just get stuck. But the static body's 2D itself doesn't react to physics. It doesn't fall, it doesn't bounce, it doesn't do stuff like that. The rigid body 2D is going to react to physics. So it'll fall if there's gravity, it'll bounce off of things if it collides with things. and it has all the other physics properties. And then the kinematic body 2D is a special type of rigid body that we use for our characters and our player that will, run into things. So it'll get blocked by things. Things can bounce off of it. It can bounce off of things as well, and it can slide across surfaces and stuff like that, but it also has the ability to be controlled, so we can move it and add forces to it and stuff like that. So it's a special type of physics body that allows the user to control it. So anyway, we're still going to use an area 2D for our projectile. So just like I did yesterday, I'm going to call this a fireball, and I'm going to save this in my scenes folder as fireball. And so now we have a few components that we need to add to make this work. So we need an animated sprite to add our art, and let's start with that. So for our animated sprite, we need to add some frames. So I'm going to click on the frames, new sprite frames, and click on my sprite frames. And we need one animation for the default when the projectile is flying, and we need another animation from when the projectile hits something. So for my flying animation, I'm going to choose the little waffle to add frames and go to sprites. And there's my projectile fireball. I'm going to open that up, zoom in a little bit. We have 2 horizontal frames and 3 vertical frames. And for the flying part, oh, whoops, I went the wrong way. For the flying part, I just want those first 3 frames. Okay, so that's the whole animation for the flying. So let's take a look at that. And so let's zoom in a little bit and let's turn the playing on. Okay, so that's what it's looked like when it's flying. It just kind of gives it a little bit of life. It's just kind of moving the colors around a little bit. Let's go to hit and add in. So it's already selected, and we can just choose those last 3 frames. And so if we go to hit, there we go, it just hits apart. And so let's set it back to flying because that's what we want it to be doing when it enters the scene. The last thing I want to do here is turn the loop off on the hit. So that way when it hits something, the animation finishes and then it's going to disappear. So that's my art, pretty simple. Let's go ahead and add my collider. So since it is an area, we need a collision shape to tell it where to collide with stuff. So I'm going to use a collision shape 2D. And obviously my art is circular, so I'm going to use a circle. And I just want to drag this in a little bit so that my art will overlap with things before the collision is detected. So that looks pretty good. And that's pretty much all I need to do there. And then another thing I forgot to do while I was setting this up yesterday that I had to go back and do is I definitely want to make sure to choose the right layers for my fireball. So my fireball is going to go on its own special layer, the fireball layer, and it's not on the player layer, so I'm going to turn that off. And then for the mask, we don't want our fireball to interact with the player because we don't want fireballs to hit the player. The player is going to be shooting the fireballs. But it can interact with tiles, and it can interact with obstacle bodies. If it hits like a vine or something, it'll break apart. Although you don't have to do that. You could, let them go through tiles and other things. And then it's also going to be able to hit certain obstacles. So we'll use the obstacle hit there as well. So we have our layers set up and our collision set up. So then the node that we introduced for the first time yesterday is the notifier, the visibility notifier 2D. This just tells us whether or not the shape is inside of the window, the main screen of the window. And we actually want to make this bigger than the art itself. So the reason for that is what we're using this for is to detect if the fireball has left the window. We don't want to keep having the fireball be part of the scene, right? If we're the player over here and we shoot the fireball and it misses the enemy that's right here and then it goes off the screen, we don't want to keep updating the fireball if it's never going to be part of the game anymore. And so what this visibility notifier does is it tells us if we're on the screen or not, and it basically makes this square overlap with the screen. And so the reason we want the square to be bigger than the art is, let's say, if our fireball was like this and our screen was right here, if our notifier is on the other side of the screen, but we can still see the fireball art, it's going to disappear suddenly. So we want to make sure that the fireball is all the way off the screen before we make it disappear. So our visibility notifier is going to be larger than the art. Okay, so then I need two more components. I just need a couple sounds to play when the fireball is shot and when it hits something. I'm going to use an audio stream player, and I'm going to actually have two of these. So I'm going to just hit Command D to duplicate it, or Control D. And so this is when I shoot the fireball, and this is when I hit the fireball. I didn't make specific sounds for this, so I just chose this like something else sound that I kind of liked and didn't have a specific reason for it, but I thought it might be useful, and it's gonna be useful for this. So I'm gonna use it. So when I shoot, I'm gonna play the something else sound, and I'm gonna turn the volume down just a little bit. I'm gonna do -6 on the volume. This is kind of loud. And I'm gonna turn autoplay to on. So that way, as soon as the fireball enters the scene, we're gonna hear that shoot sound play once. And then for the hit sound, this isn't gonna autoplay because it plays when it hits something. I will turn the volume down. And I'm also gonna turn the pitch scale down a little bit, so it's just a little bit different when it hits something than when it enters the scene. So I'm gonna load the same sound for that. You could obviously use two different sounds for this, and that might make sense. I'm being a little bit lazy here because I didn't create a specific sound for this object. And I just wanna kind of throw something in there. Okay, so looking back, I actually started recording a little bit after starting to create the script. So let's go back and just create the script. So I'm gonna click on my main fireball node, and I'm gonna click on my script in the inspector, click on the empty, and I'm gonna create a new script. So I'm gonna call this projectile because I'm actually gonna use it for both of my fireball and my ice ball. And I wanna make sure to put this in the scripts folder. I'm gonna do that and click create. And so we have the extends area 2D. Let's close all our other tabs to make this a little bit easier to read. So the beginning of the script is pretty simple. We just have a few parameters to decide how the projectile is going to act. Some of the script that I wrote in class is different from what we see here. So I'm gonna post the new script on my GitHub, and I'll share that with everybody. So the first variable that we need is the speed, and we're gonna initialize this one. And I have this at 400, but I ended up using something more like 25 here. The speed was a little bit too fast when we were testing. I'm not gonna make this an export variable because since we're instantiating this fireball, it's never gonna actually be in the editor. So we don't really have a chance to change it there. So if you want to make fireballs with different speeds, you may need to add a different script, or you could just change the speed from the script where the fireball gets instantiated, which we'll work on a bit. So the next thing that we have is the velocity. This is just like the player velocity. This just allows us to set the directionality and speed that the fireball is going to update. And so this just gets a vector 2. And we're going to fill that in later with some values to determine how the fireball will move. So last we have, oops, I forgot the 2 here. And then last we have a little Boolean called is flying. And this is kind of like our is moving Boolean on the player. We actually want to set this to true to begin with. So when the fireball runs into something, we don't want it to keep moving. So we have that little Boolean to turn it off so that it'll keep animating and existing, but it won't be moving anymore because that would look kind of weird. So next we want to update our fireball. So we're going to use our physics process for this to just move the fireball across the screen. I'm going to say func for function, and then underscore gives me the Godot functions. And you can see we have this physics process with the delta. Remember, that is the change in time between frames. So we're going to set the speed of the fireball based on the change in time of our game. Okay, and I think that brings us up to the point where we started yesterday. So I'm going to switch over to the recording from class. I will link to that later. So sorry about that. I forgot to start recording, but now I am recording. And yeah, I've just done the art. We're getting into the code now. And I'll link to last semester's video to kind of fill in. So sorry about that. Anyway, so we've got our physics process. And so this is kind of similar to our player. We want to check if the projectile should still be moving before we move it. So we'll say if is flying. And so this just tells us if it's still flying. So we can set is flying to false if we run into something. So that way it won't keep changing the movement. So next, we're just going to we're just going to change our velocity according to our speed and our angle. And if we want to use gravity, we can also use gravity. So I have gravity here. Gravity is actually kind of optional. So we'll come back to that in a second, but let's just start with our position. So position is the position of whatever scene this script is attached to. And so we're going to change the position. We're going to change the position. We're going to say plus equals velocity times delta. So this is kind of like doing our own move and slide function, but with our projectile, we're not standing on a platform, so we don't need to worry about the slide component of things. So let's add gravity later. So we want to multiply our velocity times the physics process delta, the change in time, times the overall speed of our projectile, which is set up here. So once we update our position, this is going to move our projectile across the window. The next thing we want to do is update the rotation. So we'll say rotation equals velocity dot angle. And so this is the cool thing. This code is actually really simple that I was mentioning earlier. So this is basically just mapping the velocity of our projectile to its rotation. And the way that's going to work, so I'll explain that real quick. So let's say this is our projectile and our player is standing right here and they just shoot it in this direction. So the velocity is going to be something like x equals 400 because the speed is 400 and y equals 0 because we're only moving in the x direction if we shoot directly to the right. Okay, so then our rotation is going to be the angle of this velocity. And so this velocity is a vector that basically looks like this. But what the angle does is it just tells us what this angle is, not like the whole thing. So the angle here is going to be 0. And so our, projectile is just going to go like that. But let's say our player was aiming up. Then the velocity would be like, 400 on X, but it might be like something like 100 on Y. So now the angle is actually up here. So we get the measurement of this angle and we rotate our art in our fireball to face that way. So that's like a really simple way that Godot gives us of rotating the angle of our art to match the trajectory of our projectile.
Professor?
Yeah.
X and Y, are they quantified in milliseconds or time on screen or?
So it's putting all of those things together. So the delta here gives us the amount of time since the last frame in the physics process.
Okay.
And we're multiplying that by the velocity, which is like the directionality. So if we shoot like this way, we're gonna, whatever that direction is times how much time has passed times the overall speed that we assign to the projectile. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so that's actually everything that we need for our movement to begin with. Then right here, this is when we basically say, if we've left the screen, then we're going to get rid of this projectile. And we want to put that in the physics process because that's when we're going to be checking to see if it's on screen. So here we just say if, and then we're going to get a reference to our visibility notifier with the $sign. So we just say visibility notifier 2D, and then that has a method inside of it called is on screen. And if that's true, then it'll be on the screen. So we actually want to put a little not in front of here. So if it's not on the screen, then we do our little cue free, which is just going to remove the object from the scene. Okay, so there's a couple little parts in here. Let's add them a little bit later. So we can actually shoot our projectiles, and then we'll come back and actually add this. Yeah, we'll set up so we can actually shoot the projectiles and then come back to this code. So let's go back up here. So this is where we're going to start. We're going to add these projectiles to our player controller so that our player can shoot the projectiles. So the first thing we want to do, let's open a scene so we can test. So I'm going to open up my platformer scene. Actually, let's open up level 1. That'll be better. So I've got some enemies that I can shoot at in here. And I've got my little player guy. And so I'm actually going to add this code to the player script. I'm going to click on this script here. And so I'm going to give the player the ability to shoot these fireballs. And one thing that I want to do before I add in my code is map one of my keys to the shoot button. So I'm going to go to project settings, input map, and make sure I have something to shoot with. So I have, let's see, I have move right, move left, move up, move down. I have jump. And I have action. So I'll just use action. I've already got it on here. I've got it mapped to Z and F. But I'll just use that for now. I don't really need a separate action key. So I think that'll be fine. So I've already got that set up. And so this code here is how I actually get a reference to my projectile. So see that packed scene, and it has an export, and that's so we can actually load the projectile into that, that variable there. So I'm gonna go export, and then I'm gonna say parentheses packed scene. And this is basically just saying a scene that's not in the actual scene yet, but we're gonna add it in. And then we're gonna say variable, and then we're gonna say, I'll just call this fireball. And that's what will show up. So if I click on my player node, we get this new script variable in the inspector, fireball, and I can click on that and go to load, and I can go to scenes, and I can choose my fireball scene. So this again is my projectile, but this could be anything. This could be an enemy, it could be coins that you instantiate as the player is playing. You can really put anything in here. So we've got this fireball now. And so now we want to shoot it. So first we have to see if the player is shooting. So for this one, instead of shoot, I'm going to use action. And do I have a shoot? I don't know if my player has a, let's check my player animations. Okay, so in my movement, I'm going to do this in my platformer movement. I could make like a separate function for this, but I'm just going to put it in my platformer movement. So if input dot is action just pressed. So I want to do just pressed so that I can't just like spam this and just like hold down the action key. So I'm going to use action here. And so if the action is just pressed, I'm going to call a function that doesn't exist yet called shoot. And what else do I need to do? I'm going to play this animation, and I'm going to turn is moving to false. I'm going to put those in the shoot function, actually, so that probably makes more sense to put them down there. So let's go down. I have a lot of code in my player at this point. So let's collapse some of these functions to make it easier to read. Talk function, end talk function, enemy collision. Okay, so after my dies function, I have a shoot function. And so we'll say animated sprite.play and play the player shoot animation. That's not really, the most important thing, but it's good to have that in there. And then we want to turn off the player is moving just for a second, so that they don't keep moving while we're shooting. And that will also prevent them from playing a separate animation. So you can see in our physics process, if we're not moving, we're not going to update our animation, which is actually good because that would overwrite this shoot animation. So there's different ways to kind of handle those animations, but this is one way to do it. So then the actually important part is now here where we actually create the projectile. Okay, so I'm gonna create the projectile instance. So I'm gonna create a new variable. I'm gonna say P for projectile, and I'm gonna say projectile, or actually I called it fireball here. So I should be more consistent when I name stuff, but that's okay. So this is fireball.instance. That's the important part, is this dot instance. This creates a new instance, and I can create as many of these as I want. So now we've got an instance of the fireball. We're going to set the position of the fireball to the position of the player. So it's going to appear, so I'm going to say p.position equals position. So this position is the position of the player. This position is the position of my fireball. And so I'm using self here. I wonder why I'm doing that. Maybe there's some, should just be able to use position. Anyway, there's a couple different things I can choose to use the directionality. So in this first line of code here, the way that I'm setting the directionality is according to which direction the player is facing, which I'm getting using which if the animated sprite is flipped or not, which is a little bit of a hacky way to do this. I could probably just also, actually that's probably an easy way to do it. And the other way I'm doing it is by setting, oh, actually that's what I'm doing here, is setting according to the mouse position. So let's do the direction first, and then we'll do the mouse position as a second possibility. And then the last line here is adding the projectile to the scene. So now we want to set the velocity of the projectile. So I'm going to say p.velocity.x, and we'll set this according to the player's direction, as I mentioned. And I'm using a little bit of a fancy thing here. So I'm saying p.speed times, so the speed is obviously the speed of the projectile. And I'm doing this kind of fancy thing here where I'm saying -1 if animated sprite.flip h equals, or I think, yeah, if animated sprite.flip h. And what that means, this is true if my player is facing left because of the way that I have it set up. And then I can say else just regular 1. And so this is kind of like a fancy way of saying like -1 if my player is facing left, otherwise just regular 1. And so then I'm going to add my projectile to the scene. So the way I do this is owner.addChild. So owner is the owner of the player, which is actually the main scene. And so we're saying owner.addChild to the main scene. So owner.addChild, and then we add in the projectile. Okay, so this should be enough to see if that works. Let's go to level 1 and test it. Okay, so there's my player. If I hit X, I jump. If I hit Z, uh-oh, I think I have an error because now everything's broken. Let's check my debugger and see what my error was. So I forgot to do that. Let's go back and do that. So the reason that that happened is because as soon as I added the projectile to my scene, it probably killed my player because they were overlapping, and I haven't set the right layer for my fireball. So let's go to the area and go to my collision object 2D and make sure this is on the right layer. So the layer I want to put this on, I don't have a layer for this yet, so let's create one. Let's go to project settings, and general, and scroll down to layer names, 2D physics. And so let's create a couple of layers for my projectile. So let's say fireball and Iceball. Okay. So now let's make sure to add the right layers. So for my fireball, it's on the fireball layer, it's not on the player layer. And then we don't want to interact with the player because the player is shooting the fireball. So we want to hit the obstacle hit. So I'm going to choose the obstacle hit as the player, as the layer that it interacts with. And then we also may want our fireballs to disappear if they hit obstacles like the walls and stuff like that. So let's also mask the tiles and the obstacle body if it hits one of our like little vine things. Okay, I think that should be good. And let's try that again, and hopefully we won't break our scene again. So another thing I had trouble with yesterday was getting these animations to play correctly. I'm gonna bring this in, I'm gonna debug this, and then we will make sure that everything works. I might remove some of this video if it takes me a while to debug this. Let's see. Okay, so let's go to my player scene. And the problem that we have here is that there's no shoot animation, or there is a shoot animation, but let's add in the new shoot animation that I created, which is a little bit shorter, which is actually just throw. And let's add in these frames. And let's try it again, see how it goes. So the projectile comes out way faster than the animation, so let's just speed up the animation a lot. Let's do 10 FPS. So I don't really remember why I had turning off the player movement when the player shoots, but it doesn't really seem to be necessary. So I'm just going to take out that whole part. I'll let the player just keep moving around even when it's shooting. So then the problem I was having with the player animation is that if I play the shoot animation, if I'm still moving the player, it gets overridden by my update animation section. So there's a couple ways that I can deal with that. I can add another Boolean in, so to say the player is shooting, and then check for that before I do any of this stuff. Or I can do what I'm doing and play the shoot animation and turn off the movement. But the problem with that is that my player, if the player is not moving, then they kind of get suspended in the air and other kind of goofy things happen. So why don't we just add another Boolean that will override all of the other animations. So we'll call this is shooting. And we'll set this to false. And so now when we shoot, we'll say is shooting equals true. But this is a little bit different than the jump. The condition for when we want to stop shooting is not when the player hits the ground or when the projectile leaves the scene, because the projectile is going to last for a while. So instead, let's replace is moving with is shooting equals false. So we're just going to play the animation once, no matter what else happens. So as soon as the shoot animation is done, we set is shooting back to false. And so let's update our animation. So we'll just start with shooting. So this will override everything else. If is shooting. So if is shooting, so we already started playing this animation. So we'll just say pass. This is a way to just say, ignore this. And then we'll turn our jump if statement into an elif. And so basically say if we're shooting, then pass, and then nothing else will happen. And then if we're not shooting, then we'll go back to our regular code here. I think this will work. Let's give it a shot. So if I shoot, I see it. And if I jump, so that's pretty cool. Now I can shoot and jump at the same time. So that is definitely a better solution than whatever I was trying to do in this code. I think this worked last semester for whatever reason, but I must have changed some stuff in the player controller. So I'll update this code and I'll put something on a GitHub repo that you guys can take a look at. So I guess the settings must be a little bit different. I don't know if it's, I don't really know. So let's turn the speed way down. Let's do like 10. and we'll turn the rotation back on, turn this guy back on. So the speed is way too fast. It's just basically disappearing. Okay, so that's a little bit more reasonable. Okay, so let's try 50 for the speed. Okay, that's a little bit too fast. So let's try 25. Okay, that's pretty good. So notice that it's instantiating from the player's feet. And that's because I actually set up the player a little bit differently this semester where their feet are kind of at the bottom. So there's a couple ways that we can deal with that. We could create a spawn position for the fireball, but we can also just change the position in our code. So we set the position to the player's position, and then we can just change it. So I could say p.position.x, and then minus equals, or actually we want to move it a little bit forward. Although actually we don't really want to do that because then it's going to look different. So let's just change the y. So let's say y minus equals like, how big is our player? Like 32. So you can change the position a little bit. Okay, so now it looks like it's coming out of his head, kind of. So that's close enough. You could move it down a little bit, but at least we're getting some fireballs. I'm not hearing the shoot sound. Let me double check that that is set to autoplay. Okay, we want to hear that as soon as the game starts. Okay, so that works now. So then the fireballs are always going to the right. So we can bring back our code in the player controller when we change the direction. So we're going to multiply this again. It's -1 if animated sprite dot flip underscore h else 1. So that'll set the direction based on which direction the player is facing. So now if I go and preview this again, if I go to the right, oh, flip H. Oh, I spelled animated wrong. Oops. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, so now I'm shooting based on the direction of the player. So that's one option. So I'll put a comment and leave this here. I'll say shoot in direction of the player. Another option, which in the code, I actually have this as a sort of default for the projectile, but we could do this in the player code as well. So I'm going to comment this out. Another option is to shoot towards the mouse. And to do this, we're going to set the velocity based on the position of the mouse. And this is actually pretty easy in Godot because it's a pretty common thing to do in a game. So what we're going to do is set the velocity. We're going to get the position of the mouse here. We're going to normalize it. Normalizing it is basically like taking the overall direction, but then reducing it to 1. And then we're just going to set the velocity towards that position. So it's actually really, really simple. I could just copy this line and paste it in here. And this is for my projectile. So I'm just going to say p.velocity. And so now it's going to go towards wherever the mouse is. It still is going to have the keyboard as the button that shoots it. But if you wanted to change that, you could just change the input to the mouse button. Okay, so now it's shooting towards my mouse, although I forgot to multiply it by speed. But notice that the direction or rotation of the projectile is also facing towards the mouse. And that's because in my projectile script, that's what this rotation equals velocity.angle is doing. So Godot kind of has these built-in things that make it really easy to create something that we want to do. Okay, so once we get this velocity, we do need to multiply this by the speed. So we'll say times p.speed. And so now it'll go the same speed as my other ones. Okay, so that's another option. I'm going to leave that in there. A couple other things to go over. So if I go back to my projectile, so if I want to use gravity, in my script I have this as a default, but we can make this an option. So let's add another variable to say var use gravity, and we'll set this by false by default. But we can say if use gravity. And so this is if you want your projectile to act like it's reacting to gravity. And so it's basically just like applying gravity to our player. We can just say velocity plus equals gravity times delta over speed. This is just kind of a simple way to apply gravity to the velocity of our projectile. So we'll say velocity dot y, that's the vertical velocity, equals gravity times delta. And this one is actually divided by speed. So that's going to be applying gravity kind of like over time. Whoops, didn't want to do that. And so here, since this is an instantiated thing, we can't like change this in the editor. So we have to actually decide if we want our projectile to use gravity when we create it. So in my player controller, once I create the projectile, I can say p.useGravity equals true. So this is just another option. You don't have to do this. But now if I go back to my player, so you can see the gravity is getting applied slowly. But it's also kind of making it fly flat. I wonder, for some reason the physics just seem really, like the speed was all off. Let me see if the calculation is different here. So if use gravity, velocity dot y equals gravity times delta over speed. Seems fine. I don't see anything else that's wrong. Let's try just putting in a value here. Let's see if we just put in 100. Let's see what that looks like. That's not really doing anything. Let's ramp it up to 800. It's not really doing the same thing that it should be. I wonder if I'm missing anything. Oh, I'm doing equals. This has got to be plus equals. Okay, that was a dumb typo. So I'm adding to gravity. I'm not setting gravity every frame. Okay. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see, but you can see there's a little bit of an arc to our projectile now. It's not just going directly straight. And if we change the speed, if I turn the speed down a little bit, you'll be able to see that arc more. Okay, so again, that's just an option. If you want to use gravity, you don't need to use gravity. It can just fly straight. Okay. All right, so we have a couple more things to cover. Sorry, this is taking a little bit longer. I keep making dumb errors. So now we need to deal with what happens if the projectile actually hits stuff. And so there's a couple different possibilities. One is if the projectile hits like a wall, and one is if it actually like hits an enemy or something like that. So if we look at our area, our main node for the projectile, and go to the node section, you can see there's a bunch of different possibilities here. And so we want to think about what will happen if we hit different things. So we have area entered. This is if the area collides with another area, which is actually what we have with our obstacles. So if we look at our obstacle for our snake, the hit section where we can actually hit the snake is an area. So if our fireball collides with another area, then we can be reasonably certain that it's the snake because we don't have a lot of other things in our scene. If we had other things in our scene, we'd have to check what it is, but we actually don't have that much other stuff, so we can just use this. If it hits a body, we can assume that that is a wall, and so we can just get rid of it without hurting the body. So let's start with the area. So I'm gonna double click on this and just connect it. So we're connecting this event if our fireball hits another area 2D. What we're gonna do is we're first gonna play the hit animation for the fireball. So we'll say animated sprite.play hit. And then we'll also play the sound. So we'll say animated sprite, or sorry, we'll say $ hit dot play, and that's just dot play. So we're going to play that sound as well. And then we have to hit the obstacle itself. So remember, inside of the obstacle, I have this function called hit. This is if something hits the enemy. And so we can just use the same function, even though it's not our player, it's still going to attack this enemy. So we'll just call that function from that enemy. So in projectile, we'll say area. This is really the enemy, but it's part of the enemy. So we need to get the script from the enemy. So you can see right here, it says area.getParent. So the area is part of the enemy. So to get the main part of the enemy, we have to use this getParent function. So we'll say area.get_parent, and then we'll call that hit function. And that should actually do everything that we need to do. Oh, also we'll turn off is flying. We'll say is flying equals false, so it won't keep moving. And then once this animation starts, what we want to do is when the animation finishes, that's when we're going to remove the animated sprite, just like we do with our other animations. So we'll go to animation finished on our animated sprite and connect that to our main fireball node. And then we'll ask what the animation is. So if animated sprite dot animation equals hit, then we'll call our queue free and get rid of this projectile. Okay, so we have one more thing to do if we hit just a regular wall. So we'll use body entered for that. So I'm going to click on body entered and connect. And so if we hit just a regular body, now we're going to do most of the same stuff, but there's no parent to hit. So we'll just do everything else here except for hitting the area. And we could probably put this in a different function so we don't have to copy this whole thing again, but I'm just going to leave it like that for now. And let's see. Yeah, I think that's everything. So let's go back to our level. So now we should actually be able to hit enemies and also see the projectile hit the wall. So, oh, I have to actually... I still have the mouse, so we can see the projectile hits the walls. Oops. And let's see if we can kill the snake. I'm gonna have to go down. It's actually kind of hard to get it. Right, there we go. Okay, so it actually does kill the snake. I might want to make those areas a little bit bigger because they are kind of hard to hit. Oops. I haven't practiced this game enough. I kind of am not very good at it. Uh-oh. All right, let's just move my player over here so I can just practice. Okay, so I can actually hit my snakes and stuff. So I've got all that stuff working. So that's good. So now the one last thing that I want to do is add some other projectiles to attack the player. So I realize we're getting kind of close to the end of class, so I'll try to do this quickly. Sorry, this took longer, even though I said it was going to take a long time. It took even longer than I thought it would. And so we can use most of the same code for our Iceball projectile, but the difference is our player is not going to be creating the ice balls. So we need something else to create them. And there's a few ways to do that. We could use our scene manager. We could create a whole new script. So I'm going to create a different script to do this. So first I need to make my ice ball scene. I'm going to do this really quickly. I'm just going to find my fireball scene. I'm going to duplicate it and call it Iceball. And I'm just going to go in here and change the animations. That's the only thing that I need to do. Everything else about this script can be exactly the same. So I'm going to go to the flying animation and go to my animation frames and choose the Iceball and zoom in a little bit. 2 horizontal frames, 3 vertical frames. And let's delete the fireball frames. Okay, easy enough. Do the same thing for the getting hit animation. Okay, so that's my ice ball, super easy. Everything else about it is exactly the same. But now I need a way to actually add the ice balls into the scene. And so there's a few different ways I can do this. You might want them to just be sitting around in the scene. They don't necessarily have to be moving. They could be coming out of the enemies. But I'm just going to create a special script just to add in my ice balls. So I could add this to the scene manager, but I want to add another node just to kind of keep these things separate. So I'm going to go to my level 1, add a child node, and just add a basic node 2D. And I'm going to put this kind of up here with my obstacles and call this Iceballs. And I'll add a new script here. And I'll go to my scripts folder, make sure it's in the right place. I can call this Iceballs GD. I probably want to call this Iceball Manager because it's a little bit more specific. And I'll create this. And so now I'm going to use a lot of the same code from my player, but I'm just going to put them into this Iceballs. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a timer to add the Iceballs. So that way it's not happening constantly. It'll happen every once in a while to create this kind of extra obstacle for my player. So to start, I'm going to go to the player controller and just copy and paste some code. So I'm going to get this export packed scene variable fireball and add that here. And obviously I'm going to change this to Iceball. So then if I click on my Iceballs, here's my Iceball script variable. I'm going to go to load and go to scenes and add in my Iceball. And actually there is one thing I want to change about my Iceball before I do all this code. I want to change the layers. So the layer for the Iceball needs to be the Iceball layer. And the Iceball is only going to hurt the player, not the obstacles. So I'm going to turn off the obstacle layers and turn on the player layer. Okay, so that should be good. And so let's go back to our script and go to the Iceball manager. And so this is the part that's a little bit tricky is I want to create these ice balls, but I want to kind of do them only at certain times. And depending on how you set this up, you could do it in waves. You could make a bunch of them at the same time. But you want to kind of, create them at intervals. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a little timer. And this is something that happens a lot in programming, so it's a good thing to be aware of. So basically, the way that a timer works is I'm going to have two things. I'm going to have an interval, and an interval is how far I want to count. So let's say our interval is like once every second, so it's going to be 60. So 60 frames per second will count 60 times. Then we have a counter that's going to start at 0, and we're going to add 1 for every frame. So every time our game runs 1 frame, we'll do +1. So eventually, our interval 60 will equal our counter. And when that happens, we are going to add an ice ball. And then we're going to reset our counter. So then we'll say counter equals 0. So this is just an easy way to create an interval for something that you want to happen, every second or every 2 seconds or however many times it is. And it's something that we use in code a lot. So I'm going to create an interval. I'm going to say variable interval. And we'll do one, let's do one every 30 frames, so we'll see more of them. And then a variable for the counter, start at 0. And then we're going to create a process for this. So we'll use the physics process. So we'll say func physics process. And one thing I can do to make this work a little bit better as well, I could also use the delta here. So I could use an interval. Let's say I wanted my interval to actually be like, 30 seconds or a second. Let's actually use the delta here because that's going to be a little bit better. I'm going to change the interval to like 0.5. So that'll actually be like 0.5 seconds. So instead of adding 1, we'll say counter plus equals delta. And so then if the counter is, let's say, greater than or equal to the interval in case it goes above, then we're going to, first of all, reset the counter. So counter equals 0. So we'll start counting over again. And then we'll add our ice ball. So I'm going to go back to the player controller to find the code for the ice ball. And so what we'll do is I'm just going to copy all this code and then we will adjust it as needed. So we'll say variable p is iceball.instance. This is our projectile. So then we have to set the position. So let's set the position. So actually, that's a good question. We need to know where the player is if we want to shoot an ice ball at the player. So let's track the player. How are we going to get a reference to the player? That is a good question because this is an instantiated scene. Let's see. Okay, there's definitely a better way to do this. I'll take a look at that later. I don't have time right now. Okay. Okay, maybe we can just try to directly get the player. Oop. Maybe we can go back and get the player.
The way I had detected like the player for my for some stuff that I had made was using like a area that would detect a body entered, and then that would help
Oh
it
yeah,
track.
to trigger it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've got the player now, so that's good. But I'm not seeing the ice balls. So let's see. Let's print out the ice ball. If that works. Okay, so it is adding the fireballs. You can see that in the output, but we're not seeing them on the screen. Let's change the position and see if we can just see them appear first. Okay, so we see them now. Okay, so let's change the interval because that's too fast. So they're appearing. So let's change the position and then let's just do a little bit less. See if that works. Okay, there's our ice ball. So then let's see if we can set the velocity. Oh, actually, we need to get the player. Okay, so what we need to do here, actually, something more sophisticated. We need to say p.position minus player.position to get the difference. Between the two. Okay, I guess the other way around. Player.position minus p.position. There we go. And it's a little bit too fast, so let's normalize this. So I'm gonna put this in a parentheses and say dot normalized. Okay, now it's too slow, so let's multiply it by the speed times p dot speed. Okay, so now we've got it moving. Let's move this over a little bit. And so now let's move this farther away so it comes from off the screen. So we'll move it up and over. Oh, okay, now I'm realizing, okay. It's getting removed because of this. Okay, so we need to set something up so it doesn't die until it's on the screen at least once. So let's say entered screen equals false. And so we'll say if not on screen and not entered screen. And then we'll just, if it has entered the screen, then we can set is on screen to true. Entered screen equals true. So that way it won't get removed unless it's already entered the screen. So that should fix that issue. Nope. Okay, where is it? Iceballs. Iceballs manager. Okay, let's change this back to 256. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it's not actually hitting the player, which is another thing, or it's not like hurting the player. So there's some other code that we also need to add in here, but we're almost to the end of class, and I feel bad. I very much underestimated how many errors I would make while I was doing this. It's been a while since I tried one of these. So I'll figure out these issues, and I'll just wrap them up and publish the code later. So sorry about that. Hopefully that was still useful. I think, you guys can still see how this will be useful in your games. In this class, I kind of got to adding this Iceball manager. So let's bring this back in and go over a few different things that you can do with this to create Iceballs. Okay, so let's focus on our Iceball manager. So we have a couple issues. One is that the Iceball doesn't actually hit the player. And the other is that we want to add Iceballs in kind of different scenarios. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. So if you have specific ideas for what you want to do that you're not sure how to do them, let me know. We could go over it. But I'm going to go over a couple things that I think you might want to try. So keep in mind that the Iceball is just like a little projectile that's going to be coming out of the sky. It has the same speed and other qualities as our basic projectile. If you don't want that to be the case, you can set it up a little bit differently. You might not need your player to even shoot projectiles, so then you wouldn't need to share that script. So there's a lot of different ways that you could kind of update this if you're using different types of obstacles or enemies. But just to, so we have our thing set up. Let's add it. So we have our Iceball set up. Let's start shooting it again. And essentially what we're doing is every time we hit this interval of 1 second using our counter, we're creating a new instance of an ice ball. And then we're getting a reference to where the player is in the scene. And we are then setting the position of the ice ball relative to where the player is. We could actually make this a little bit simpler by just saying plus vector 2 and putting the position in here, 256 and 256. And so what that's doing is it's kind of like if we have, and this is kind of based on the window. So if you have a resizable window, you could get the window size and then base it on that. But I always know what size my window is. So this is my window. The player is always like pretty close to the middle of the window. That's another thing that you might want to change. And so we're taking the player and then we're moving up 256. So the ice ball is going to start above the window. And we're also moving to the right 256. So it's going to start somewhere over here. We could put it a little bit farther if we want it to take longer to get to the player. So maybe we could do like 300 and 300 or something like that. And it creates this angle at which it's going to approach the player. So if you want the ice ball to come straight down, you could change just the Y and not the X. Or if you want it to come from over here, you could do that. If you want to randomize it, you could use a random function in Godot. I'm not going to do that right now, but if that's something you're interested in, we could talk about how to do that. You could also make a whole bunch of them and make them all come in the same direction. And right now, so that's setting up the ice ball. Let's look at that for a second and then continue. So let's get rid of this part. We can also move this player reference so that we don't have to do it every single time. So let's put that up here and we'll make this an on ready. So we'll say on ready, we'll get a reference to the player. And so we can use that in the future. So this will work here. That way we don't have to get it every single time. So we're going to make an instance of our ice ball, and then we're going to position that ice ball relative to where the player is. And then we're going to shoot it towards the player. So this is another thing, we don't actually have to do it exactly like this. So let's talk about that in a second. But let's take a look at what this looks like. So my ice ball is coming from below the player. I forgot again. I need to go negative on the y-axis to make it go from above the player. There we go. So now it looks like there are ice balls raining from the sky. But it's always coming from the same place. Let's actually slow down the interval a little bit because it's quite long. There's a lot of ice balls, so let's do 2. So we're shooting towards the player, and the way we're doing this is a little bit complicated. I didn't really go over this in full detail during class, but essentially what I'm doing is here's my window, here's my player, the position of the player is here, and I calculate the ice ball to start up here. And then I want to aim the ice ball towards the player. And so what I'm doing is I'm subtracting the player position from the ice ball position. That gives me this vector here, basically the X and the Y of this. And then I'm normalizing it. So I'm essentially taking what this angle is and turning it into like a smaller vector that just gives me a direction. And then I'm multiplying that by the speed of the ice ball. So basically, if this is like the normalized vector, and then I'm multiplying that by the speed, and so that makes it a little bit bigger, and then it adds that every frame going towards the player. So we don't actually have to do it this way. If you could just make it kind of shoot straight down or straight across or whatever you think makes sense. So another way that we could do this is just say velocity equals vector 2. And we could say 0 on the x, so it's just going straight down, and -1, or actually +1 on the y times e dot speed. And so that will shoot our vector down. So it's actually not going to hit the player, right? Because it's still here. So let's put it directly above the player. And we could also put a few of these. So we have like a function that creates So actually we want to shoot directly down. So let's turn off this X, this 0 here. And so now it's going to come right down wherever the player is. So we could also do like a little wave. And so this is going to be a little bit trickier because we don't want to have to repeat this whole block of code a bunch of times. But what we could do is put this in a separate function. So let's say function shoot Iceball, and we'll give it an X and Y. So it'll know where to shoot from. And let's just copy all this code and throw it in here. So this is a little bit tricky. Just want to go over a couple things that you can do here. So this is if we want a wave of ice balls. So let's make sure to spell Iceball correctly. So we could say Iceball. So we could say shoot Iceball, and we could have one that starts like 100. Let's start at -200 and -256 on the Y, or let's do -300 on the Y. And so then this -200 is going to go to this X, and this -300 is going to go to this Y. So let's put those here and here. And they're all just going to go straight down in this case. So then I can just copy this, and I'm going to paste it a whole bunch of times. And there's better ways to do this as well, but I don't want to get way too crazy with different things in this lesson. So I'm just going to change the position of each one of these. So now we have like a nice wave of ice balls that are going to shoot down. So now we get 3 at the same time. I forgot to make these positive. So let's make this positive and positive. So now we're going to get 5 ice balls coming down. So that is that's a much bigger challenge. And so we could also change the directionality a little bit. Maybe we can make them go +1, or let's go -1 in the X direction and see what that does. So now they're going to go at an angle. Oops. Oh, I got an error because of this area.getParent hit. It must have hit an area that I forgot about. All right, so I'm getting an error because my fireball is hitting an item. Let's see. It shouldn't be hitting an item. Oh, but I have an item that's on the player layer. Of course I do. So let's take this off the player layer. And we're gonna have to do that with all of our items. Okay, so let's try it again. Okay, so now I have a much scarier set of ice balls that are attacking the player in waves. So that's pretty cool. Again, you don't have to do it this way, but this is just one way to do it. So making this extra function makes it a lot easier. There's also something that you could use called a loop here, but that's a whole other concept. So I'm not going to get into that right now. I just want to fix one more thing, which is that the ice balls are not actually hurting the player. And that's because our player does not have a hit function. And so in our projectile, what's happening is when the fireball is entering, or in this case, the ice ball is entering a body, which should be the player body, nothing's happening. And so what we want to do is call the hit function of the player, but it also runs into walls and stuff like that. So not everything has a hit function. So we need to actually check here to make sure this is the player. So let's print out the body. So let's say print body and then play this. And so we'll see when the ice ball hits the player. Oh, they're all missing the player because of the angle they're taking. So let's go back to the ice ball manager. So let's do 0.5. on the X. So I think that'll be more likely to hit the player. It's just barely missing it. Okay, so that one hit him. So you can see down here in the output all of the things that are getting hit, and one of them is this player here. Okay, so we can check the name of this body. So let's try that. And then we can compare that to the player. Okay, so you can see when it hits the player, the name is the player. So what we can do is say if body.name equals player, then what we want to do is our player has this enemy collision function. We can just call that. So let's go back to our projectile. And so if the body is the player, we can say body.enemy collision. And one thing that we have to update is if we look at our fireball scene, it's never going to collide with the player because it doesn't mask for the player. But we need to update our Iceball scene because our Iceball scene should interact with the player. So we can see the mask for the player is already there. And let's change this to Iceball, just since we're here. Okay, so now we should see the player actually get hurt and die if they get hit by enough Iceballs. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty much everything when it comes to the projectiles. Sorry, it's a little disorganized because I wanted to try to cover a few different things. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of what's possible. If you want to do more with this, like have multiple waves or change the timing or change the directionality, and you're not really sure how to do it, let me know and we can go over it, different ways to do this. So yeah, my code has differed a lot from what I actually have in this lab here. So what I'll do is just publish my code online somewhere and include a link in the YouTube video, and I'll post it on Discord as well. So that way you guys can compare the code there to what you're seeing in the video. And really, like, this code still works. Like, there's nothing wrong with this code, but I just did a few more variations that might be useful. All right, so that's it for this video. Sorry it's so long. Just wanted to cover a few different options here. Let me know if you have any questions.